Pastor Ed here with Daily Devotions for Thursday, May the 11th, 2023. We continue our weekly look at this past week's lesson from Romans 1, 1 to 17. We're actually going to have 4 weeks of readings from Romans, kind of a little mini sermon series on Sundays. And then during the week following, like today, we're going to maybe unpack things a little bit more. I want to concentrate on a word that appears 3 times in our reading. It's the word called or calling. Right away in that first verse of Romans 1, Paul says, a servant of Jesus Christ called to be an apostle. And then later on in verse 6, he's talking to the Romans. He said, including yourselves who are called to belong to Jesus Christ. And then finally in the next verse, he said, to all God's beloved in Rome who are called to be saints. So he talks about being called to be an apostle, being called to belong to Jesus Christ, and being called to be a saint. And so I just want to briefly talk about what that means. The Greek word is kletos, and it means to be called. It appears apparently 11 times in the New Testament, 7 of which are in Paul's letters, 4 times here in Romans and 3 in 1 Corinthians. So it's a popular word for him. And the first thing that Paul says, of course, is that he was called to be an apostle. The Greek word sounds a lot like our English word, or our English word sounds a lot like the Greek word apostolos. It means a delegate, a messenger, somebody who's sent forth. And in the context here, Paul talks about being called to be an apostle and then set apart for the gospel of Christ to be basically a preacher, a proclaimer of the good news of Jesus Christ. So he is a delegate, a messenger, one sent forth. That's what he's been called to do. Then he also talks about everybody that he's writing to in Romans, and really all of us as well, that we are called to belong to Jesus Christ. The interesting thing is that word belong doesn't appear in the Greek. It simply says the called of Jesus Christ, but it implies that sense of belonging. And that's an important aspect of being a Christian and being a part of the body of Christ, the community, the congregation. We've talked recently about or maybe it was in my sermon, the idea of being a solitary Christian is an oxymoron. It doesn't make any sense. We're called to have a sense of belonging, and yet some research a few years back said that fully a third, or as many as a half, of all Protestant church members do not feel a sense of belonging in the congregation where they belong. And so there's a kind of a heartbreaking story that I've shared before. A fellow by the name of Keith Miller talks about a woman who was in a group that he was a part of, and she talked about losing her parents at a young age, being sent to an orphanage. She was not an exceptional child. She was not particularly pretty, and she waited, and she was hoping to be adopted and loved, but it didn't seem to happen for a long time. And then finally one day she was adopted by a family, but she was reminded, and of course as a child it probably didn't sink in, that this was just kind of a trial kind of thing. It might not work out to be a permanent arrangement, but she had the highest of hopes that it would turn out. So she went with this family. She went to school. She was the happiest little girl, at least for a little while. But then one day, a few months into it, she came home from school, ran to the big old house where she lived with this family. No one was at home. The place was empty. In the middle of the front hall was her battered suitcase with her little coat thrown across it. And she finally realized, sadly, that she didn't belong there anymore. And everybody's crying as she's telling this story. But then she cleared her throat and said, this happened to me 7 times before I was 13. But it was these experiences that ultimately brought me to God. And there I found what I'd always longed for, a place, a sense of belonging, a forever family. We belong as Christians to Jesus Christ. We have that sense, no matter what else is going on in our lives, no matter how lonely, and they're talking so much these days about the epidemic of loneliness in our country. We have something in the church to offer a sense of belonging, that we belong to Jesus Christ. So Paul was called to be an apostle. We're all called to belong to Jesus Christ. We're also called to be saints, a holy thing. The Greek word is hagios, and it comes from hagnos, another Greek word which means sacred or pure or clean. And I love this story. I've told it before. I'll tell it again about the definition of a saint. Little boy went with his parents touring Europe one summer, and part of the tour involved touring some of the great old cathedrals of the past. And after he went from one cathedral to the next, he was impressed, in particular, by the massive stained glass windows and the portraits of the disciples that were depicted. And so when he got home, he was asked by a Sunday school teacher about his experience, what he liked the most. And he said, I love the sense of awe and hugeness of who God must be. I love the stained glass windows with their images of saints. And the teacher asked, well, what is a saint? And the little boy thought about it, thought about his experience, that impression. He said, a saint is a person the light shines through. And that's probably as good a definition of what a saint is. We have no light of our own, but the light of Christ, the light of God, shines through us. And so Paul was called to be an apostle. We are all called to belong to Jesus Christ, and we are called to be saints. We are called to be like those big stained glass windows, that the light of Christ shines through us. That's our calling, to be a part of Christ and to share Christ with the world. Well, we'll continue tomorrow with our look at Romans 1:1-17. Until then, take care. Bye.